So we're just going to have a chat about question 3. Yeah, so what do you think about question 3?
Quite open.
Yeah, didn't know for sure like what you were expecting. Like, was it somehow what we discussed in the project with this, or more the papers you handed out, for instance, for the climate change issues?
So I'm thinking very much of the projects, but it's up to you. At the same time, yeah, you don't have to write on the thing that you did your project on. Yeah, that's interesting. You could absolutely talk about climate as well, why not? Although, yeah, climate's so big, so... Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about climate. So remind me, what was your project on, for instance?
I had greenhouse gases in animal production.
Right, yeah.
Like one aspect of climate.
So then, if we take that one, for instance, what policy instruments have been applied to help solve the problem? Any thoughts on that? From anybody? So the greenhouse gases from... Did you talk about agriculture in general, or you talked mostly about meat, didn't you?
Animal production.
Yeah.
Like some aspects were referring to the more general agriculture, but the focus mainly on animal production.
So what policy instruments have been applied to help cut greenhouse gases from animal production? Have any ideas?
There's some subsidies for like having more grazing animals, and I mean that could be one policy instrument to make it less invasive, or like, because if you have cows and feeding lots and you feed them only soybean instead of
So on the one hand, that's bad from the land use stuff that you looked at.
yeah.
The soybean thing is not so good, but on the other hand, if you look just at the emissions
So if they go
from the local emissions, it's like you get more emissions from the grazing cattle, because they live for longer, they grow more slowly, so yeah, it's tricky. I guess we never talked about this, or you certainly didn't talk about it, but there are regulations about the handling of manure and so on, aren't there? Which
Yeah.
might help to reduce emissions from manure, I don't know.
But this is, I think, also more local. What is it NH3? One emission, but I think this is also more.
That's
local
more about.
emission, not so much climate.
It's more about emissions to water and.
Yeah. So yeah, like nitrate for the groundwater and this NH3 for the local air pollution.
Yeah.
So I think this is also the thing with agriculture in general, that there are certain environmental aspects addressed, but I believe it's not so much about climate change. It's often also when you have like the livestock production that the stables need to have some filters for.
Yeah.
Also NH3 or these PM10.
Yeah, particulate matter. Yeah.
Also included. So since it affects the environment in several aspects, the policies undertaken also direct in to these several aspects, and sometimes are counterproductive for other environmental
Right.
aspects.
So the short answer to part A, if you wanted to talk about climate climate emissions from agriculture would be not a lot, or nothing almost. And you could even say that some of the instruments that are applied for other things make the climate problem worse. Yeah, so then you're kind of in trouble with this question, aren't you, if you want to talk about that? Because then it's always a dilemma with these open questions. And unless you make them totally open, I want you to be able to choose a topic, but then some topics just don't fit. So like with this one, to what extent have these instruments helped to move the economy towards first best? Oh, there weren't any instruments. So yeah, it's kind of tricky. I definitely need to think about this.
Probably the same for the land issue, how many policies.
Well, you see, what you could do there, and maybe to an extent on Friedrichs, would be to say there's a bunch of policy instruments in other areas that can maybe make the problems that I'm focusing on worse.
Yeah. But that wouldn't, I wouldn't interpret it as I had answered the question, since you're supposed to discuss the policy instruments that have been applied to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And then I'm discussing policy instruments that has worsened the problem.
Yeah.
I guess that's kind of
So
the opposite. But that's how I would interpret it.
yeah, sure. So you need to you either need to be careful in explaining that you're aware of this, that okay, you're discussing the problem, the relevant policy instruments that have to do with the problem, but actually they're not helping, they're making it worse. I think would be fine. Or you can just define your problem slightly differently and say, if you define it more broadly, and then you can say, okay, we've had these policy instruments to deal with these aspects of the problem, in this more broadly defined problem, but then they've also made other aspects worse, like climate would definitely be, and then everybody should be fine. Whatever your topic, you should be fine on C, right? So let's see, what topic did you have, Elin?
NOx emissions from people cars.
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, and you were talking, so Alexander was talking about low emission zones, and you were talking about, what policy instruments were you talking about? I can't remember.
Like putting a tax or subsidizing other types of vehicles.
Yeah, so you were also looking at vehicle choice.
Yeah.
And technology choice.
But if I were to answer this question on exam, I would rather talk about climate change.
Yeah.
The articles that we presented.
Right. Okay, so what sort of things then are you thinking of?
I don't know, but I feel more comfortable. Because I don't know what literature I would refer to. I don't know, I would think it would be simpler to speak about climate change.
Yeah. So I'm thinking here with reference to relevant literature. Yeah, it might sound like, okay, you have to cite 10 papers here or something. But that's not the idea. So, yeah, it could be just the one paper minimum. Could be, if you wanted to talk about your topic from the project, then So if it said with reference to the relevant literature, that would be, okay, I want the state of the art. You know, what's the research frontier here? But when I'm saying with reference to relevant literature, it's like, take something that has to do with the problem and discuss your ideas. So the risk with climate is that it's going to be very general and vague, and you're going to have trouble sort of demonstrating your sort of understanding of the concepts because it's going to be too vague. So like, I mean, you can do it on climate, but you need to be aware then of that risk. But so yeah, what about you, Alexander? So what for your low emission zones, and do you think that would work for this question, or?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I don't know really
So-
how I should approach it, but I think I would probably choose something with vehicle emissions.
And then the policy instruments could be, say, the low emission zones.
Yeah.
And have they helped move the economy to first best, or to the planner's allocation? What do you think? So what did your paper? We even did that analysis on the board, didn't we? Or I did. I remember I drew the picture.
Yeah. Well, it was first best, right? No, it's of course not. But
But the analysis in the paper suggested that at least it somehow moved in the direction of first best,
Yeah.
because the benefits outweighed the costs according to that analysis.
Yeah.
So therefore, by definition, somehow it's gone in the right direction. So that would be. And how could you further improve the situation?
I don't know. I probably would discuss like stricter policies or something
Yeah.
like that.
And I mean, just a straightforward thing is like these low emission zones. They don't exist everywhere, do they?
No.
So like, if they're working so well, maybe more cities should be doing that.
Okay.
Maybe they work better than congestion charges, or because congestion charges make a lot of sense if you've got congestion. If that's your big problem, well, that's what you're trying to tackle. But congestion charges probably aren't that great if you're really trying to tackle pollution. Yeah, and in a way, the door is also open, like discuss ideas on how to further improve the situation. You could also discuss, I was thinking of your ring roads and things.
Yeah.
You could discuss bad ideas as well and say like these ones don't work because. What do you say, Janina? So what was your project on?
Waste management?
Yeah, you were the commune Grobis, who was.
Huh?
I remember you were telling us that you'd worked at a
Yeah.
waste reception centre or whatever.
I'm not sure, like, there's no first best or social planner resource allocation for that, really.
Oh, in theory there is one, but we've no idea what it is.
So could I just say that, like, I don't know, but there's certainly, you can see what countries seem to want, like, how they would like to.
I think you should say that, like, we don't know.
Okay.
It's not that you don't, it's not that you don't know because you haven't read the literature. It's like nobody really knows what the first best way of handling waste is. The analysis just isn't there, and it's too complicated.
Okay, yeah.
But then you could express opinions.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it's always good if you're expressing opinions to make clear that this is an opinion. So, okay, this is the state of research, and then this is my opinion, going beyond that kind of. And then, of course, you can say, okay, let's assume that first best is much more recycling and reuse and so on. And then say, okay, how can we achieve that at low cost? Because we're always going to want to do it. If the first best involves a lot of recycling and so on, then we also, clearly we want it to be cost effective. So how can we achieve that cost effectively? And then you've got the ideas like the four compartment bins, or like laws about recycling. Because actually, I mean, it's illegal, right, to chuck stuff in certain stuff. I'm pretty sure it's illegal to chuck into burnable. Like there was.
I'm
Sure,
there
some
are-
things are very unsuitable.
No, but there was a case. Maybe I dreamt it.
I think I've heard, I'm not really sure about this, but I've heard when I was in Austria that they tax you if you don't sort your garbage right. If you would like put glass into burnable,
Right.
you would get a fine for that.
Yeah. That is surely illegal in Sweden. I can't imagine that it's not somehow. I either dreamt it or I actually read it in the local paper that someone got charged for chucking their old Bamse tidningar. Do you know what a Bamse tidning is? No. How do you translate that? Sort of,
It's a children's magazine. Like,
yeah. Into burnable. And the thing is, the address label was on the. It was one of these deliveries with the address on the magazine, so they knew what household it was. And then they sort of said, "Look, you're not allowed to chuck this stuff in burnable. This has to be recycled." But then they defended and said, "Look, we gave them away to someone, and they must have chucked them." Or maybe I just dreamt it. What about you, Johanna?
Yeah,
Oh, you talked about the.
being very stance on climate.
So you were actually talking about climate, yeah. Yeah, so that would give you a clear focus if you wanted to talk. Okay. So you could say like, okay, the environmental problem is climate change, but this is huge. I'm going to look at in the particular aspect related to international negotiations. And then similar, like if you want, I would recommend something like that. Although the fit isn't perfect, is it? Because it's like, okay, what policy instruments have been applied? Okay, you would then have to say, okay, well, yeah, we're going to interpret international agreements as sort of policy instruments. And then the problem is sort of, what do you try to agree about? Do we have these? It was you who talked about top down and bottom up and so on, yeah. So you could have that discussion about different kinds of policy that they're trying to agree about. And have they helped or not? And how can we do it better? Yeah, so you could make that fit quite well, yeah. So it's always likely, if I'm going to give you a question of this type, it's not going to fit all the different kinds of cases equally well. So you're going to have to, if you want to talk about a particular case, you might have to sort of shoehorn it in a bit. And then you just need to explain what you're doing in that case. Does that seem reasonable? Yeah. Should we have a look at question 4?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is really related to one or two of the videos on the climate papers, right? So spillovers are bigger. Consider a two-period economic model. Second period, other firms build on the first firm's knowledge and reap benefits. The more firms there are in the second period, the bigger are the spillover benefits. Okay, so spillover benefits are bigger in an expanding sector than they are in a shrinking sector, which means that the first thing, the consequence of that is that research is going to tend to be more undersupplied in expanding sectors than it is in shrinking sectors. It's not, you'll have more research in an expanding sector than in the shrinking sector. But the difference between the supply and what the planner would choose is bigger. So even though, of course, there'll be more researchers in the expanding sector, all else equal, but the planner would have even more in the expanding one compared to the shrinking one. Because the planner is looking to the future and saying, look, all this research being done now in this expanding sector is going to be built on massively in the future by so many other researchers. It's going to be really, really valuable. So we want this done. Okay. So what does this have to do with climate policy? Over to you guys. What does that have to do with climate policy?
Well, clean energy tends to be an expanding sector, and so if the subsidies equal for R&D, if it's a big question.
Yep. No, we're still on. You're fine, keep going.
We will tend to end up with investing more research into the dirty sector. Kind of?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, if you sort of have a naive research subsidy, which would say, look, deal with one thing at a time. So we have a flat research subsidy and we'll tax carbon emissions. That is not accounting for this effect. If we account for this effect, you should have a bigger research subsidy in the expanding sector and a smaller one in the shrinking sector than the average subsidy across normal sectors. And of course that is relevant to climate policy because the expanding sector is the clean one and you want that. That is helping climate. So it means we want to subsidize clean research more than dirty, more than fossil research, say. It's like fossil research, is that always going to be bad for the climate? It's like you might think, we don't want to get better at using fossil fuel.
I mean, it should be good for the climate because we learn to use the fossil, or it could be because we learn to use the resource more efficiently.
Yeah. But on the other hand, it's increasing the competitive advantage of fossil. So it's a kind of a double-edged sword, fossil efficiency, because it's making it tougher for the really clean technologies to take over. But all else equal, the more efficiency the better, whatever the sector. Okay. So how can we deal with this problem? So there's a sort of naive answer and then there's problems with it. So what's the simple answer?
Subsidize in that way.
Right, just subsidize the clean research more, a lot more maybe. than fossil-oriented research and other kinds of research. What's the problem with that?
How do you categorize that?
That's part of it, yeah.
We discussed this problem that for research you don't have like control what will be achieved. Like when you order a bridge to be built, you see, okay, there's no bridge, why did I pay you? In research you never know the outcome.
Right. So it makes it harder. That's exactly the terms that I talked in, isn't it? And that makes it harder to subsidize research and to efficiently to actually then to know that it's going to make a difference. Like if you don't pay for the bridge, no one's going to build the bridge, right? If you do, it'll be built, and if it's not, you'll get your money back. But with research, if you don't subsidize it, maybe it would have happened anyway, and if you do, maybe it won't happen anyway. Researchers just carry on anyway with what they were doing, and then after 10 years they say, oh, we're sorry, we didn't come up with anything. So there's a huge information problem associated with paying for research. It's like you never really quite know. You can't control what you're going to get if you're in the seat of being the regulator trying to pay people to do research. And generally, the bigger proportion of the research that you pay for, the less sure you can be that your money's well spent. So if you can control and know that a firm is spending 88 million crowns a year on research and you chip in 2 million, you can be pretty confident that they're going to be spending the money, if it's all going into the same pot, kind of, you can be pretty sure that they're going to be trying to make sure this money is well spent. Because 80% of it is coming from them, right? But if you're paying 80% of the costs and they're paying 20, then you can be pretty sure they're going to come up with all sorts of wacky ideas to try out. And of course, it could be that's what you want. You know, you want them to take risks and so on. If you really want them to take risks, you're going to have to pay almost all the costs. But it's a tricky business, yeah. So, to the extent that it is super tricky, what else can you do? To encourage more research.
Maybe you could ban things you don't want, so they have to come up with new solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch. That's actually, I don't think we've talked about that paper, or maybe I did mention it. That's related to my most cited paper, which was in my PhD thesis. It's published in 2004, where I basically point that out. There's a bunch of things you can do with kind of tougher policy than you would otherwise have, which doesn't necessarily directly affect research, but it does indirectly. So just a very simple idea is just to have a higher tax, emissions tax, than you would otherwise, than the Pigovian level. To try to just push harder to get more research done. Because you at the Pigovian tax, you know that research is going to be undersupplied. The abatement effort will be just right, given today's technology, but the efforts to come up with better technologies for the future will be undersupplied because of the research spillover. For the sake of argument, assume that you can't subsidize research at all. What can you do? Well, you can raise the tax a bit above the Pigovian level. And there's a downside to that, which is that you get too much abatement. But the upside is that you will incentivize firms to raise their research closer And you can also have, like you were into, like more results-based ideas that basically you wouldn't generally ban a technology until there was a good replacement. But if researchers know that if they come up with something cleaner, then you're going to ban their competition. This is basically what I say in the 2004 paper. If researchers know that if they come up with something better, you'll ban the competition, that's a massive incentive for them to do more research. Okay. So that's perhaps the trickier question, part B there. What about part C? So that's also linked to a very specific paper that I talked about in a video. I'm pretty sure I talked about it in a video. Well, in fact, I say in the footnote what paper it is. It's this Acemoglu paper. So Acemoglu and his co-authors in that paper, they say, look, we don't need a carbon tax. All we need to do is have this massive research subsidy. That's from, if you think about social planners and first best and stuff, which they don't talk about, that doesn't really make sense. Like, what would you do in first best? So they assume that there's no problem subsidizing research, kind of. So if there's no problem subsidizing research, but you do have this standing on shoulders thing. Did I use that metaphor? Yeah. What's the first best regulation going to be? So you've got damages, you've got knowledge spillovers. And there's no problem subsidizing research. There's no sort of, what do you regulate? What's the regulator going to do?
Is it the first question? Only subsidize the clean.
So you're going to subsidize the clean and not the dirty. But you're going to do something else as well. Right?
You can use a tax, I think, and then you're going to subsidize not the research, but like pioneers in that technology.
The thing is, okay, so what tax are you going to use?
The unit one.
I think you're thinking right, but you're not finding the right terminology. Can anyone help Janina, or has anyone got, like, what tax do you generally apply in first best when you can sort everything out? What do we call that tax? Right.
I'm really bad at pronouncing.
You're going to apply the Pigovian tax, yeah. So you're going to sort out one problem at a time. You're going to deal with the emissions externality with the Pigovian tax, and you're going to deal with the knowledge externality with differentiated subsidies. Okay. You're never going to ditch the tax and only subsidize. Because the tax is welfare improving, kind of, you want firms to abate. Because the subsidy is only going to give you a payoff in the future, isn't it? When they've come up with a new technology and clean things up. You want them to abate today as well, at the right level with a Pigovian tax, yeah.
So this is the first best solution.
Yeah. So there's never going to be a case, or you'd need really weird assumptions to get a case where you would choose to only subsidize research and not tax carbon. It's like, why would you ever do that? It's really hard to understand. You can do both. But the research subsidy is not going to replace the carbon tax. I mean, the extreme case would be if the subsidy is so effective that effectively there's no climate problem at all. So then you might still sort of have a tax, but it would be so low because there are never any damages, kind of. But that's never going to happen. Like, we've already got plenty of damages, even now, even if we sort everything out over the next 50 years, which is the absolute best case. There's still a lot of damages per ton of emissions today, which should always be taxed at the Govian level to get first best. Yeah, you get it.
Is there a way to internalize costs from the past, basically? Because when we have the climate problems and we have this stacking up of it's stored in the atmosphere, the CO2, but you only start at some point introducing the tax for the damages to come, but never to what was already consumed. So imagining you have then, you can have a relatively fast switch where you subsidize the clean energy research and still tax the then still fossil pollution energy production, but then there is a fast switch to clean energy.
Yeah.
And then you won't have any taxes that account for the damages that are still there, like because of the past production that was.
Yeah. So what you're trying to achieve, in theory, with the tax, it's not to do with distribution, right? It's just to do with getting agents to allocate their resources in the right way today. So these kind of tax schemes are never going to be sort of fair in the sense of dealing with past pollutions and making so if you wanted people to pay for their past pollutions and the damages caused by that, what kind of a scheme would you need then? It wouldn't be tax, it would be, can anyone come up with a word I'm after, or I mean, it does happen that you find that, this firm left this site 20 years ago, and now we discover there's all this crap under the ground, and that's illegally left there. What do you do then? They're kind of liable, aren't they? It's liability. You could take them to court and say, you have to pay to clean this up, if the firm still exists. And actually, I can't remember if we ever looked at that paper or not. I think I mentioned it. There's a really interesting paper, I think it's really interesting, that's saying, look, why don't we set up a liability scheme and measure emissions country by country, and then say, in 50 years, you're going to be liable for the damages in proportion to your emissions. And that would actually also be efficient in a Pigovian kind of sense, because you'd have to be able to trade liabilities. So a country which was emitting a lot and didn't believe that there were going to be any more damages, it could take on other countries' liabilities and say, we don't think these are going to cost anything. So we'll take them. We'll buy them at a negative price. You can hand us your liabilities and give us $50 a ton, or $25 a ton per liability, because we don't think the damages are going to be more than that. And you'd end up with a market for liabilities, which would look like that it would be just like a permit market, in a sense, and you'd have a global price for carbon. If you could have a global agreement that we're all going to be liable, the holders of liabilities will be liable to pay damages in X years. So sort of to deal with the sort of fairness aspects about old emissions, you would need to agree about liability, basically. Is that answering your point
Yeah,
at all?
to some extent. Like, because, I was also wondering about, like, all the damages that already happen in this scenario plays it to some extent, okay, in the future we will all have these damages, and then, we see who's liable and who has to pay for it. So, it's the same concept, I think, just put in the future, then looking back then from now on.
Right. Yeah. Okay, we're out of time.